No, I'm not. I started by saying that one of the relations between capitalism and democracy is contradiction. You can't have capitalist democracy. And the people who really sort of believe in markets, or at least pretend to understand that. So if you read Milton Friedman and other apostles of so-called libertarianism, they don't call for democracy. They call for what they call freedom, which is a very restrictive concept of freedom. It's not the freedom of a working person to control their work, their lives, and so on. It's their freedom to submit themselves to control by a higher authority. That's called freedom, but not democracy. They don't like democracy, and they're right. Capitalism and democracy really are inconsistent. Actually, what's called libertarianism in the United States is about as extreme an example of anti-libertarianism that you can imagine. They're in favor of private tyranny, the worst kind of tyranny. Tyranny by unaccountable private concentrations of wealth. When they say, well, we don't want government interference in the market, they mean that. They mean, maybe they don't understand it, but if you think it through, it's pretty obvious. The kind of interference in the market they want to block is the kind that would permit unconstrained tyranny on the part of totally unaccountable private tyrannies, which is what corporations are. It's worth bearing in mind how radically opposed this is to classical liberalism. Now, they like to invoke, say, Adam Smith, but if you read Adam Smith, he said the opposite. He's famous for not, the claim is that he was opposed to regulation, government regulation, interference in markets. It's not true. He was in favor of regulation, as he put it, when it benefits the working man. He was against interference when it benefited the masters. That's traditional classical liberalism. This, what's called libertarian in the United States, which likes to invoke the history that they've concocted, is radically opposed to basic classical libertarian principles. And it's kind of astonishing to me that a lot of young people, say college students, are attracted by this kind of thing. I mean, you can, after all, read the classical texts. So take, say, Adam Smith. I mean, Adam Smith at the time, he's the icon, of liberty. He was considered to be a dangerous radical at the time because he was pretty anti-capitalist. It's sort of pre-capitalist era, but he was opposed to it. He condemned what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. That's an abomination. Take the phrase invisible hand. Everybody's learned that in high school or college. Adam Smith actually did use the term, rarely, but take a look at how he used it. In Wealth of Nations, his major work, it's used once. If you look at the context, it's an argument against what is now called neoliberal globalization. And what he argued is this. He was concerned with England, of course. He said, suppose in England that the merchants and manufacturers invested abroad and imported from abroad. He said, well, that would be profitable for them, but would be harmful to the people of England. However, they will have enough of a commitment to their own country, to England, what's called a home bias in the literature. They'll have enough of a home bias so that, as if by an invisible hand, they'll keep to the less profitable actions, and England will be saved from the ravages of what we call neoliberal globalization. That's the one use of the term in Wealth of Nations. In his other major work, Moral Sentiments, term's also used once. And the context is this. Remember, England's basically an agricultural country then. He says, suppose some landlord accumulates an enormous amount of land and everybody else has to work for him. He says, well, that it won't turn out too badly. And the reason is that the landlord will be motivated by his natural sympathy for other people. So he will make sure that the necessities of life and the goods available will be distributed equitably to the people on his lands, and it'll end up with an equal, relatively equal and just distribution of wealth, as if by an invisible hand. That's his other use of the term. Just compare that with what you're taught in school or what you read in the newspapers. And it goes across the board, like everybody probably has read the first paragraphs of Wealth of Nations, which talks about how wonderful it is that the butcher pursues his interests and the baker pursues his interests. We're all happy. So we should be in favor of a division of labor. Everybody's read that. How many people have read a couple of hundred pages into Wealth of Nations where he has a bitter attack on division of labor for interesting reasons, and reasons that were standard in the Enlightenment environment in which he lived, very different from ours. He says if you pursue division of labor, people will be directed to actions in which they'll just repeat the same mechanical operations over and over. They'll be de-skilled. Okay, that's the goal of management for 100 years, de-skill the workforce. He says that's what will happen if you pursue division of labor. He goes on to say this will turn people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a human being can possibly be. And therefore, in any civilized society, the government will have to intervene to prevent any development like this. And that's Adam Smith's view of division of labor.